Well, this is it, everyone. The end of an empire. Disease, death, and brotherly deceit were all behind the end of the Inca. With superior weapons and tactics, the Spanish swept away the Inca in little more than a generation. The arrival of the visitors to the New World and consequent collapse of the Inca Empire was one of the greatest humanitarian disasters to ever befall the Americas. In this lecture, you will learn intricate details about the arrival of the Spanish and their interactions with the Inca. Additionally, you're going to also find that all was not lost, as the descendants of the Inca still survive to this day. In a nutshell, the conquest marks the end of the Inca Empire and the beginning of Spanish rule. So despite the fall of the Inca, this defeat did not signify the cultural death of its descendants. In fact, many aspects of Inca culture have survived through to present times, including many visual and performing arts. I just want to reiterate that point because there tends to be this fascination with the disappearance of a cultural group, like the Maya. The Maya didn't actually disappear, and it's the same thing for the Inca. They're still around to this day. Early encounters with the Inca were spearheaded by Francisco Pizarro, who was born in either 1471 or 1476, and died definitely in 1541. An interesting side note is that Pizarro was the second cousin of Mexico's conquistador Hernan Cortez. Pizarro, the illegitimate son of a colonel in Spain, traveled to the Americas in search of wealth and a better life. Essentially, he was living in Panama when he heard of Cortez's successes in Mexico, so he decided to travel down the South American coastline to check it out. In total, he made 3 expeditions to the Inca Empire. The first was unsuccessful. The second, in 1526, introduced him to the grandiosity of the Inca Empire. And the third, which started in 1530, led to the end of the empire. Now, important to note is that Pizarro was always accompanied by his partner, Diego de Almagro. In addition to Almagro, Pizarro was accompanied by 150 soldiers and his half-brothers on this third expedition. Upon arrival, Pizarro discovered an empire in turmoil, which was already feeling the effects of smallpox. Now, the disease may have traveled with Pizarro in his second expedition, but it likely arrived due to the movement of people from central Mexico, where the disease had already taken hold. So in addition to smallpox, there had also been a round of successive violent wars between the 2 eldest sons of Sapa Inca Huayna Capac. These sons, Atahualpa and Huascar, did not get along at all. At the end of these wars, Huascar was crowned successor in line for the throne, while Atahualpa governed the imperial army. Now, with the sudden death of Huayna Capac, the empire was again thrown into a tailspin when Atahualpa and Huascar again began fighting for the throne, which unfortunately made it easier for Pizarro to come in. Atahualpa, the now self-proclaimed Sapa Inca, received word of a group of strange, light-skinned, bearded men heading inland. So he did what any good Sapa Inca would do. He set up a military front line in the town of Cajamarca. Atahualpa lured Pizarro and his men with gifts to meet him in Cajamarca, where he had 6,000 soldiers waiting. Now, unbeknownst to Atahualpa, Pizarro had sent one of his brothers to scout the meeting location and saw the 6,000 men organizing. So it became clear to the Spanish that they had the advantage when they saw that the Inca only had slings, stones, and clubs for weapons. Unfortunately for the Inca, the Spanish had horses and metal armor. On November 16, 1532, at nightfall, Pizarro met with Atahualpa in Cajamarca. Now, Atahualpa had just arrived with great fanfare when a Spanish friar issued a requerimiento, which in this case was a royal requirement or verbal proclamation asserting authority over the territory of the Inca. Now, obviously, Atahualpa did not understand this at all, so the Spanish then offered the Sapa Inca a breviary, telling him that it spoke the word of God. Now, a breviary is a book of prayers or a religious text. So Atahualpa threw this book to the ground in frustration as he thought it would actually speak to him. Now, the Spaniards were severely offended by what they interpreted as Atahualpa's rejections of both authority and the sanctity of God. It was this event that marked the beginning of a series of bloody conflicts which would soon bring an end to the Inca Empire. After the breviary incident, Pizarro ordered his army to attack. Unknown to the Inca, Pizarro had hidden men and horses around the houses of Cajamarca. So they charged on horseback towards the Inca, sounding trumpets, in addition to the deafening sounds of the arquebuses, which were large shotgun-like guns. All of these things would have been completely new and terrifying for the Inca. So, in response, the Inca army retreated. Now, according to chroniclers, the Inca had the intention of capturing the Spanish, but the Spanish intended to slaughter and conquer. By morning, all 6,000 Inca men were killed by the 150 Spanish soldiers, with no Spanish soldiers being killed. Pizarro captured Atahualpa and held him hostage, and in an effort to compromise with the Spanish, Atahualpa offered himself as ransom. In exchange for his release, Atahualpa promised Pizarro he would fill a huge room from floor to ceiling with gold. After 2 months, Atahualpa had obtained thousands of gold dishes, goblets, jars, and basins, but still did not have enough. So he permitted one of his men to travel with the Spanish to Cuzco, where the Spanish then stripped the Coricancha of its gold and immediately melted it down. Amazingly, while in captivity, Atahualpa still continued to rule the empire, although under very compromising conditions. At this time, he ordered the assassination of his brother Huascar, which was just an absolute tactical blunder and sealed the fate of the Inca. So instead of passing the throne back to his brother to help charge an army, he decided it was better for him to die, which was just an insane decision. But after more time and filling the room with more gold, Pizarro deemed the ransom was not enough. So on July 26, 1533, Atahualpa was publicly garroted, which is basically a way of strangling someone to death. In 1533, Pizarro appointed Atahualpa's youngest brother, Manco Inca, as the new ruler of this transitional empire. Now, despite being appointed Sapa Inca, Manco quickly realized it was all a farce and a joke. So, in retaliation, he tried to attack the Spanish in Cuzco, but failed. In 1537, he retreated to Vilcabamba, a city located 80 miles west of Cuzco, where he established a Neo-Inca state which lasted for more than 30 years. Unfortunately, he too was eventually killed by Spanish wanderers in 1544. During the Conquest period, war broke out not only between the Inca and the Spanish, but also among the Spanish. Specifically, they fought for how to divide the golden ransom, with Almagro and his men thinking it was not a fair split. As a result, the Spanish eventually divided into those that supported Pizarro and those that supported Almagro. On April 26, 1538, the Battle of Las Salinas took place, where the two groups fought over who would control the city of Cuzco. Now, Pizarro and his crew won, and in July of 1538, they assassinated Almagro. After the death of Almagro, his supporters actually appointed his son the governor of Peru, and in retaliation, Pizarro was then murdered on June 26, 1541, in the newly established city of Lima. And in fact, Pizarro's body still rests in Lima to this day at the Lima Cathedral. After Manco Inca's death, his sons took his place. His son Sari Tupac governed the Neo-Inca state until in 1560, when he renounced his imperial claim after negotiations with the Spanish, which basically marked him as a traitor. His brother Titu Cusi Yupanqui then took over. Titu was famous for his written account of the conquest of Peru from an Inca perspective. This was called an Inca account of the conquest. Now, he ruled until he died from illness in 1571. After the death of Titu, Tupac Amaru was the next and final ruler of the Neo-Inca state, which officially ended with his beheading in Cuzco in 1572. Now, the Spanish at this point had led a campaign to wipe out all indigenous defiance to colonial rule, and had thus made Tupac Amaru the primary target. The arrival of the Spanish introduced what can only be described as a demographic collapse. It is difficult to calculate the death toll, but scholars estimate the pre-conquest population of the empire was anywhere from 4 to 15 million people. And after the arrival of the Spanish, they estimate around 50% of the total population died from warfare and disease. Now, we will never truly know the total loss, since the first accurate census was not performed until 1570. As I mentioned on the previous slide, aside from war casualties, disease caused the greatest devastation to the Inca population. The primary diseases which affected the Inca were smallpox, measles, malaria, and typhus, for which they had no immunity to. These diseases were easily communicable and spread like wildfire, and in fact, as I mentioned before, diseases had spread to the Inca Empire even before the Spanish had arrived. Now, some areas were thought to have been more affected than others. For example, the death toll reached 95% in heavily populated areas. Immediately following the conquest, the Spanish began the process of settling and colonizing the Inca territory. Within decades, Spanish systems of government, religion, and social structure took over. The two primary objectives of the Spanish were the extraction of wealth and the conversion of indigenous peoples who had survived to Catholicism. To enforce their legitimacy as rulers over the Inca, the Spanish added themselves to Inca mythological stories. For example, they posted illustrations of the Inca lineage showing how the Spanish were related to the founding brother and sister of the Inca Empire, pure propaganda. They also forced elite women to marry high-standing Spanish men, because as such, their children would inherit both Spanish and Inca royal bloodlines. Furthermore, the arrival of enslaved Africans in Peru also further diversified the colonial population. One way the Spanish were able to continue their dominance was through the encomienda system, which was the building block of the Spanish colonial economy. Essentially, guys, it was slavery under the guise of religion. It consisted of a tract of land that relied on the exploitation of indigenous labor parties. The Spanish told the indigenous people they were working to save their souls, and thus they went without pay. Primary products the Spanish were using this system for were potatoes, maize, tomatoes, and coca, as well as gold and silver mining and animal domestication. Word about mining prospects made its way back to Spain, so more settlers from Spain began to trickle into Peru. By 1600, the population exploded to well over 100,000 Spanish. Now, by the end of the 17th century, mining resources did begin to dwindle, so people began new business prospects, including farming plantations, as well as expanding the Spanish territory. The Spanish quickly began city-building campaigns, with some cities even being built on top of Inca ruins. The best example of this is the city of Cuzco, where the Spanish used Inca stone from dismantled buildings to build their own constructions. Now, other cities, like Trujillo in Peru, for example, were brand new built locations. Many indigenous people were involved in constructing Spanish churches, cathedrals, and estates, some of which still stand today. The construction of initial colonial cities is well documented. The first official city was Piura, built in 1532 in Peru. Piura was quickly followed by the construction of the Spanish-era Quito and Cusco in 1534, and then followed by Lima in 1535. Dominant features of all of these cities were a central plaza or main square, as well as a church, jail, and municipal buildings. Now, importantly to note, only Spaniards were allowed to live within the city limits. All indigenous peoples had to live on the outskirts or resettled to the countryside. This relocation of indigenous Inca was referred to as the reducciones. Reducciones were nucleated villages for indigenous-only residents designed to concentrate native populations. This practice was initiated by Viceroy Francisco de Toledo in 1569. It was a forced movement and was not cooperative. The Inca actually had no choice in this. This process split kin groups and ancestral groups, thereby undermining Inca identity and allowed the Spanish to maintain their separate and indigenous spheres. Other than disease and warfare, the Spanish also brought with them the alphabet. They tried introducing the alphabet to adults who aberrantly refused to learn this form of communication. Thus, the Spanish then began forcing young children to learn their writing methods. Now, keep in mind, many Inca oral traditions continued even to this day, but always away from Spanish ears. Now, I do want to note that the Spanish did use the Inca quipu and found it quite useful, but it was soon abandoned after 1600. The other primary goal of the Spanish was religious conversion. The first missionaries in Peru were the Franciscans, who arrived as a group of 12 to represent the 12 apostles. Now, this, of course, meant nothing to the Inca. The Franciscans were followed by the Dominicans, the Mercedarians, and finally the Jesuits. The basic mission of these groups was to convert the Inca by destruction of all Inca temples and religious objects. They quickly learned that this did not work, since the Inca still continued to worship. So the Franciscans and Jesuits infused Catholic beliefs with indigenous beliefs. This was accomplished through a variety of methods, including holding Mass at huacas and celebrating Catholic holidays at the same time as traditional Inca ceremonies. Now, keep this in mind, many Inca refused to give up their religion and continued to practice in secret. For example, at high-altitude sites, it was documented that they still worshipped Inti and Pachamama, regardless of Spanish influence. Additionally, as was documented in the 17th century, they continued human and llama sacrifice, although to a lesser degree. One of the greatest achievements and acts of solidarity of surviving Inca was the founding of the Cusco School during the end of the 17th century by a group of indigenous artists. Many Spanish artists mistreated native Andean artists through exploitation, having set them up in assembly lines, as well as failing to recognize their achievements and refuse to promote the Inca artists. After years of protest and ending with legal action, they were allowed to form a school for indigenous artists, where they produced massive amounts of works that infused traditional art styles. Although the Inca were conquered more than 450 years ago, they reside in the collective memory of many Andeans today. The survival of traditions, like the Inti Raymi festival, is an example of their persistence. More recent interest in the Inca has been a double-edged sword. It's led to preservation, but also looting. Nevertheless, Inca culture and identity remains strong and makes the Andes one of the most distinctive and fascinating places on Earth. If you haven't already, I genuinely hope you will get to visit there someday.